Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining in. We'll be starting our discussion in a few minutes. Everyone, thank you for joining in. Before we start our discussion, I would like to read out few instructions. Do follow these instructions, that way we can ensure a positive experience to all our participants. The participants are encouraged to keep the cameras on to make the virtual session engaging unless you have internet connectivity issues. In that case, you can switch off your cameras. Please keep your microphones muted. I repeat, please keep your microphones muted. Disturbance caused during the panel discussion due to unmuting may compel the council to remove the member from the meeting. You are requested to privately send in your questions through Zoom chat, either to Chitti or Anisha Alex or to the media cell. Unmuting for the same is prohibited. Kindly refrain from typing any statement or comment in the chat box that may disrespect the decorum of the meeting. If done otherwise, you can be removed from this meeting. We would also inform that this discussion will be recorded and uploaded on YouTube by tonight. The link will be shared on all the social media platforms of Media Cell. Do share the same with your friends. Kavya, if you're ready, you can continue.
Thank you, Anisha. Good evening. Welcome to the first ever event of the Media Cell of St. Stephen's College. It is my proud privilege to kickstart this event with a panel befitting the occasion. It is my privilege to introduce Mr. N. Ram, the most well-known journalist of India, who is also the director of the Hindu Group. He was the editor-in-chief of the Hindu, Frontline, Business Line, and Sports Star. Dr. Ram Manohar Reddy is the founder editor of the India Forum. He was the editor of the prestigious magazine journal Economic and Political Weekly for more than a decade. He is the author of the book Demonetization and Black Money. Ms. Seema Mustafa is the president of the Editors Guild of India and the editor of The Citizen. She has written various books, including one called Azadi's Daughter and another, which may be of great interest now, Shaheen Bagh and the Idea of India. Proud to introduce Mr. Vibodh Parthasarathi, alumni of St. Stephen's and associate professor at Jamia Milia, Islamia. He has written numerous books and papers on media, the latest being Platform Capitalism in India. His publications are a testimony to the multidisciplinary interest he holds on media research. Our moderator for today is none other than Ms. Manisha Pande, executive editor at Newslaundry and anchor of the popular satire show Nuisance. We would also like to welcome Mr. Hari Krishna Prasad, senior journalist as well. A very warm welcome to all our panelists as well as audience. Over to you, Ms. Manisha Pande.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me for this panel discussion. I have with me a very accomplished panel, 3 veteran journalists and a very well-known professor of media studies. So I'm hoping this panel is especially illuminating for students here who want to become journalists, who want to know more about journalism. The topic for today is, does the Indian media comfort the afflicted or afflict the comfortable? Now, this is actually a famous quote by a fictional character called Mr. Dooley, and I think it's sometime in the 1800s that this was published in a paper, and it was a sort of a satirical take. And the quote says that the job of the newspaper is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. So there's no or. We are supposed to be doing both, which is comforting the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Uh, but if you ask me, I think a huge chunk of media organizations today, especially big media and especially television channels, are doing the opposite. They're comforting the comfortable and afflicting the afflicted. So let's begin this discussion. Now, I have specific questions for each of my panel, but I want to just throw this one question at all of you first, and I'd like an answer from each of you, which is that now we are living in an age where news consumers are bombarded with endless information from countless sources. News consumers today are more opinionated than ever. They're more ideologically committed than ever, or at least they're more vocal about how ideologically committed they are. And today, an average news consumer is not just looking to be informed by a journalist, but they're also looking for their views to be confirmed by a journalist. So, in this scenario, I just want to throw this question to all of you: that what do you think our main duty should be as journalists in these hyper partisan times? Um, so, anyone who wants to take it can take it, or we can just begin with Ram Manohar.
Oh, yeah. Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. And we're happy to meet all of you young people who are going to, I guess many of you will be finishing college today and this year, and will be going out to what wide world is a bit of a trite saying, but anyway, yes, I don't know, it's a difficult question. It's something that we as news producers ourselves struggle with. At this point of time, I think our job as journalists is to, even if it seems almost impossible, it would be to fact check every piece of news that we put out, because that seems to be the biggest problem now, that we are living in an age of fake news in terms of deliberate falsehoods. It's not easy to fact check everything, and there are various pressures asking you not to fact check the news that you put out. But I think that is the primary responsibility, and that is where I think somewhere, in spite of all the threats, the change in the environment, the media as a whole, of course there are many exceptions, the media as a whole hasn't been doing its job in recent years. I leave it at that.
Ram, would you like to go next? I think you're on mute. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yes, I'm unmuted.
Yes, can hear you.
I'm happy that you're having this discussion. Thanks to St. Stephen's College and my co-panelists. Yes, I agree with Ram Manohar. In fact, it would be an understatement to say that the media have not been doing their job. They've been doing awful things in many places, but I agree with Ram that there are exceptions, and I would say there are significant exceptions. And we'll come to the issues later, but one is fact-checking. A lot of fake news is being put out by the police, all kinds of defamatory allegations, and often the source will not go on record. So I think it's very unprofessional, barring exceptional cases, to not name the source. So all kinds of toxic information can be planted on the media, and it is being planted on the media by unnamed or anonymous sources. And this is one disease that should be eliminated. It's well known. It afflicted the US media during the Iraq war, and there's been quite a literature on it. But in India, it is notorious that journalists, perhaps under instructions from above, perhaps on their own, it has to be studied, are putting out information with no sourcing. I think you are allowed to give a confidential source status in exceptional cases where the information is so significant and of such vital importance to the public that you can make that exception, but it's being routinely done. And that's one thing that can be avoided, but we can come to that. Media, large sections of the mainstream media are now propaganda arms of the central government and of the Hindu Rashtra ideology and project. There's no question about it. In my mind, you just got to see it. And I'll come to examples, such as how it covered the migrant workers, the crisis after the lockdown was declared in March, with just 4 hours notice. That's one. Then the Tablighi Jamaat issue, where they were demonizing those who had been actually stranded, who had come for a meeting. There's been a literature on that as well. And thirdly, communal violence in Northeast Delhi in February 2020, where the victims of the violence were sought to be made the aggressors, and those who tried to mediate and bring about peace, many of them have been charged. So it's outrageous. Some of the media have done their job, particularly those like The Wire or Scroll, Caravan, even some others in the in newspapers, major newspapers. There's been some good stuff. Rajiv Bhargava has written on it, imagining the crisis and so on in opinion pieces. But on the whole, it's the propaganda role that dominates and has come to the fore.
In fact, you raise a very interesting point about police plans, and at Newslaundry, we've covered a lot of arrests that have happened. And if you look at any arrests from Sudha Bhardwaj to Umar Khalid to Riya Chakrabarti to Disha Ravi, before the arrests, you see a primetime hysteria. So there's almost a calling for the arrest in the media, and then the arrests take place. But let's go to Seema. Role of a journalist in these hyper-partisan times, where people want more from a journalist than just keep them informed. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, done?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks. I was saying that is a good question, because we are really living in times where every citizen on the social media is a journalist himself or herself and actually thinks that they are. And we are also in a time where the gray has disappeared and it has become black and white. So you are tempted as a journalist, after you watch particularly the reality shows every night, to play judge and jury and take positions which are black and white. It is extremely important not to fall into that trap and to continue with, you have the opinion section where people can take strong positions, but in terms of reportage, you've got to check the facts, like the other journalists here have said, the editors have said. You've got to play it by the book. You've got to make it very clear that what is fake news, and you have to follow the procedure and the process and go back to the tenets of old journalism. I think that is the way really out of this mess that we are all being dragged into, particularly because of the hype every night of television channels, where they are actually playing judge, jury, calling, as you said, for the arrest of people, for the hanging of the others, for the sacking of somebody else. And then you have trends on Twitter, which all the young people are glued to, which also call for the same. So we are living in highly emotive times where facts have become secondary to opinion and to views and to the black and white that we are projecting. So as a journalist, and for all of us who are also trying to stay away from this and get back to being the fourth pillar of democracy, if you stick to the facts and you stick to the truth as much as is possible, given the human resource problems that journalism has always suffered from, I think we will be able to sort of cut through this complete polarization and bring in a sane element into the discourse.
Vibodh, your view on the media's role in these hyper-partisan times, and there's also this thinking that it's not the media, we are getting the media that we are asking for, and that it's the people that really want, these shouting matches or want somebody to be declared a criminal every night. So you want to take it from there?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So thanks. It's good to be back among fellow Stephanians, although not really back in college per se. And I think it's a good sort of venture that you all have started. And it's very important to sort of have these discussions, which are not really happening at many levels in society. So in a sense, for me, and I'm coming from the outside compared to the three analysts and the host itself here. So for me, the role of journalism would be essentially to discover abuse in society. I mean, that's a kind of compact way of looking at it. And we can get into details of that later on. What seems to be happening is that journalists and journalism is caught between this bind of speech and reach. And these seem to be sort of opposing forces. I think in terms of speech, there are two questions to look at. Who is being spoken about? I think that is something which very often one tends to sideline both while writing and while reading as well. Who's being talked about in the press? And of course, then who is doing the speaking, which is the other part of it. And there is that sort of rupture between the two of them. As far as reach is concerned, again, there is this issue of, reaching out to whom? Who do you want to address? What kind of anxieties do you want to address? What kind of interest do you want to pander to? And of course, what's the purpose of reach? I think that purpose of reach somehow is got muddled over the last 2 decades at least. And for me, I think both at the organizational level and at the level of individual journalists, this sort of, these two forces which appear to be opposing, speech and reach. I purposely didn't say speech versus reach, but speech and reach. That tension then has come to define the way in which journalism is being practiced, it's being financed, and it's being tom-tommed in certain circles.
And when you said discover abuse in society, do you want to just elaborate it a bit? Like what do you mean?
So for instance, we are sort of, living quite clearly in a society where perhaps information at a basic level, as we understood that at least a generation earlier on, that perhaps is not really the issue here. There is an issue in terms of how relevant or correct that information is there. I think beyond that, beyond sources of information, is the information that we get, or at least we have readily access to, what is that telling us about society here? And for me, journalists in general and investigative journalists in particular, that role is about discovering perhaps what's going wrong here. They could be abused by the state, they could be abused by forces from the market, they could be abused by different kinds of private institutions, abuse within the family, abused by the family, and so on and so forth. So for me, that idea of discovering abuse is the way in which I sort of try and define what journalism in these times, in an environment of apparent information explosion, is all about.
Interesting. So I wanted to go to Ram, and I wanted to ask him about, we've had farmers protesting at the border now since November almost. And before that, we've had the farmer protests in Punjab, at least places like Punjab, for almost 6 months or so before that, before they came to Delhi. And there's a deep angst among protesters about being ignored by the mainstream media. There's a huge mistrust of journalists. And I'm not just talking about journalists from certain TV channels like Z News or Republic, but there's a general mistrust against the mainstream media, to the extent that they also felt the need to start their own newspaper because they felt that they were not getting enough coverage, or that their voices were not being heard. How do you view this distrust, this break of trust between the media and the people that the media is supposed to serve? And where do you see this going? Unmute.
Well deserved. There's no doubt. If you look at the performance of the media on this, it's not that they have not covered the issues, the laws. They've tried to explain them in many mainstream newspapers, certainly, and also some of the better, at least one decent television news channel, one. I'll name just one in English, no other. But I won't name it, but I'll mention it. But compared with the barrage of propaganda by the government on the front pages as well as on primetime television, I think it's a problem. There's been some attempts to sensationalize the coverage because it makes for ratings and so on. But other than that, although it would be wrong to say that there's no significant coverage of the issues, there has been, I think. It's been overwhelmed by the propaganda aspect, and particularly after the violence broke out on Republic Day and so on. And of course, there's been some defense of those who have spoken up for farmers. There's been some criticism of the Supreme Court for that ill-judged attempt to form a committee, and then nobody knew what is the purpose of that. But on the whole, it lacks balance. But this was not the worst. This was not the worst chapter if you look at the performance of the media. In this, there are other cases where it was much worse.
You want to enumerate a few that come to your mind immediately?
Yeah, I already mentioned them, the migrant workers, the crisis. I think there's some very good attempts, including two young journalists who went on their bicycles from through the villages, followed the trail, and brought out a lot of vivid information and detail and images. Also, I think yes, the other issue is it was before the pandemic set in. Largely, it was on the CAA, the Citizenship Amendment Act. I think there was some decent coverage initially, but the propaganda element overwhelmed it later on. And the violence that came out of it, the communal violence where Muslims were largely targeted, but most of the cases are against them. I think that was much worse. And on a smaller, perhaps the other issue is the Tablighi Jamaat, the demonization that and right now the media are full of propaganda on how brilliantly India has done in handling this crisis, even on the vaccines and so on. There's a projection of, just look at the data. We've not even vaccinated, if you look at our world in data, 1% of the population, compared with 26 or 27% for the UK, among major countries. I'm not talking about Israel or UAE or Seychelles and so on, which are up around major countries. Even the US is about over 18% of its population. India is less than 1%, and we claim that we are the vaccine capital in the world, and so on. It has to be, it really has to be speeded up. And this is the job of the media. If we are going to talk at some point about the, sort of conceptual framework for what we do or we need to do, I can get into that in detail. What are the functions of the media? Where does investigation fit in? Where does sense-making fit in? Ram R has already mentioned verification. I think we have at least two brilliant fact-checking channels. Alt News, I look at it all the time. Just brilliant work. It's not just fact-checking. It's really investigative. And there are others like your organization, your venture, which are bringing out the truth in some depth, not just correcting obvious mistakes, really taking on disinformation. you need to make a distinction between misinformation, which is not deliberate, is not motivated, and disinformation, which is scaled up and is extremely toxic, which is deliberate, is intentional, so on. But so when we come to those issues, but right now,
But yeah, like the mistrust that people have of journalists, would you say this is the worst that there's ever been? Because you've been around for a while and you've seen the landscape change.
If we're both listening, I'm not going to make any such generalization. We need surveys, we need studies of this. There have been, I'm sure during the emergency, trust of the media was very, very low.
Okay.
But whether it's been measured, we don't know. But this is pretty bad. In the history of independent, let's say from the Constitution, 70 years plus, 70 years since it was adopted. This must be one of the worst chapters. When you look at the performance of the media, but I'm subject to correction by research and so on. We need more research into these things.
So Seema, you started your career in the 70s as a reporter. You've been on the field. You probably from the time where journalists were welcomed in a scene of crime or in a scene of, a news event. Journalists were literally welcomed to, people looked forward to journalists coming and covering their issues. To now you have, often you have situations where journalists are literally, thrown out of a place or asked to leave or have had to face a very hostile crowd. And this is especially in the protests that we've seen over the past 2 years. So if you compare it to IAC, where media was mostly looked at was the India Against Corruption protest, which was media was looked on as an ally, people wanted to talk to them, to CAA or students protests or even farmers protests where people literally want to, shoo media journalists away. How do you see this change? Because you also have a lot of reporters working under you. Why do you think it's changed so drastically from being welcomed to being shooed away? And what does this mean for reporters? I mean, how hard is it going to be for reporters to go out and do basic news gathering when you have such mistrust?
Yeah, absolutely. I was very fortunate because I came in as the post-emergency generation, and we grew up in journalism in the 1980s, really, which was also a decade of violence. You had Assam, you had Punjab, you had Kashmir, you had all the anti-Sikh violence, you had any amount of communal and caste strife in Bihar and UP. So we were all always out and continuously reporting under amazing editors. And that is why editors are important, because they then they're professionals and they let you know what the ethics of reporting is, that when you go out into the field, how do you report? Where is the sensitivity? Where is the compassion? Facts is one thing, but all this, reporting comes with all of this. And it was a great 10 years. It was great in the sense that you were out in the field, one, two, journalists after the emergency and editors particularly who had crawled had suddenly started, making amends. And you were really at a period where journalism knew a lot of freedom. And whenever they tried to bring in a press bill, whether it was in Karnataka or in Gundu Rao or in Bihar, Jagannath Mishra and others, you had journalists out on the roads. I don't know how many protests they were taking place. And there was a rare unity amongst journalists. Of course, this was before television, before this internet revolution as it was mainly the print media, also with business houses, but not grown into this complete corporate expanse that we are seeing now. So I think my introduction and my growth in journalism was really in as ideal a situation as it could be. Over the years, I think after television particularly came in, the big bucks came in, the big money came in, and the governments also realized that they could control the media through the corporates. They don't need to do direct censorship, which the media had become very, very sensitive to. And slowly that started. And over the past years, I won't say 4 years or 10 years, maybe 15 to 20 years, the corporates started buying over, bringing in the money, we've just read about the scam in TRP. We've seen all the, all that's been happening of how you spend money to buy TRP ratings so you get better advertisements. But you had this whole thing happening. And now, unfortunately, we've come to a situation where the professional editor has been done away with. There are so many publications and television stations where the cronies or the people selected by the corporates to do their bidding are in charge. I have actually worked for 2.5 years in television in between, and actually came across what I had never seen before, which is called the abusive newsroom, where journalists are treated like I don't know, like what, I don't even want to say animals, but treated badly. And there is a certain kind of pressure continuously not to write the truth as it is, or to black out news. So it's not just about the fake news and writing the news wrong, it is also about blacking out news. And reporters today have, because of the television channels, particularly at nights, the kind of disservice they have done to journalism in the name of journalism. And we also are responsible because we did not distance good journalism from the rubbish that you see every night. And because of that, there is a certain lack of trust and deep distrust, which impacts on all of us. Even the good reporters, the good editors, the good publications, it's difficult for people to differentiate between the liar and the truth writer. And that is where they've realized that the media can be bought and can be sold. And with that has come a lack of respect, a questioning, and which you can see, as you yourself mentioned, during the farmers' struggle, which is the first time where you see media actually being named, targeted by people who say, I don't want to talk to you. I haven't seen this, never seen this before.
Vibodh, you're teaching in Jamia, and it's after JNU, I think it's one of the most vilified universities. There's Aligarh, but Aligarh is in UP, so it's a bit away from Delhi, so they're sheltered in that sense. But I want you to just talk a bit about the power of media in shaping a narrative, and a narrative sometimes that can be really work against a people or work against a collective of people, and especially television media. How does it shape hostility, and how have you seen this role evolve over the past few years as a really shaper of hostility in society?
Yeah. I mean, this is of course something which happens immediately around me. But just to go back to the earlier point about the idea of trust, I think from the outside, if I the way I've been seeing the growth and expansion of journalism for perhaps about 25 years or so, I can't help but noticing a relationship between the decline of skepticism on part of the journalists towards their sources, and so on and so forth, and an increase in the mistrust of the audience. I think somehow these two things seem to be correlated, because over the years, I find, in a sense, I found, and again, this is purely experiential, that there are fewer journalists who are skeptical towards the world around them. In a sense, this could be some of the sort of things which the earlier panelists were talking about. And I'm wondering whether that decline of skepticism has then got translated into their work, such that what is expected and the level of trust that's expected, that then gets whittled. So for me, this is a kind of something which I've sort of picked up over the years. I mean, in terms of creating the narrative, I mean, there is a large amount of research, in a sense, which shows that the media, which is relatively more dominant, has always created a narrative. So creating a narrative as such is something not new. I mean, we've seen it much more closely over the last, most of this decade. We've seen it even in the previous decade over some issues. For instance, a clear narrative was being created. For example, I mean, if you look at the Indo-US nuclear agreement, so to say, there was a clear narrative around that. and that whole sort of thing changed from a nuclear deal to a civil deal and so on and so forth. So there was this sort of desire to create a narrative and constantly change that. I think throughout the 90s, there was a very clear narrative across all newspapers about a certain kind of economic policy that the government ought to be taking. And one of the things which I do as part of my research, and this is a kind of a luxury in a sense, is that I look through newspapers of the past, of the 70s, of the 50s, and much before that, and perhaps even the early 90s and so on and so forth. Yeah. So it's quite, this behavior is not new. Okay. There's been a piece of research which actually shows that how was a certain narrative around partition and refugees was being created in the late 1940s. Okay. But of course, there is a difference here. I think the difference, of course, is in terms of the directness and the intensity of the state in fueling this narrative. So that's one kind of big difference which is there. Yeah. The issue of abundance, because there are these many large number of television channels, which create a narrative in a more appealing way. And therefore, it's not just a narrative, but a narrative that can be digested much easily, which then also perhaps is something peculiar to our times. And let's not forget, unlike in newspapers, in television news, you don't have something called the letter to the editor. So you don't have any idea in terms of questioning what kind of narrative a particular news outlet is creating over a period of time.
Actually, no two-way communication. It's true. Like for television media, there's no.
Yeah. So television, in that sense, is kind of a unidirectional media in more ways than one.
TRPs is probably the only way.
There is some effort of that happening online, and I don't know how you sort of deal with that in your outlet or the other outlets which people are involved with here. Yeah. But that, in a sense, is largely perhaps slamming different kinds of things and making claims. There is not this discussion over the veracity of a particular narrative being proposed there. And unfortunately, in the absence of that, in the absence of sort of how the narrative is negotiated between the news suppliers and the audiences, those who then step in to so-called correct this narrative are external actors, such as the courts, for instance. Okay, so there are two kind of things which are operating here. One is this kind of hammering down of a particular kind of narrative in a more appealing manner. The virality of that narrative, again, so it spreads much faster. Okay, so it therefore gets much more diffused than what was happening earlier on with the press. And then, of course, the only recourse to question that is something outside the relationship between the press and their audiences. And that, for me, is an equally sort of dangerous point in our time, because you're constantly looking looking at the courts and other kind of bodies to sort of try and ensure that this narrative is actually, the record is sort of put straight here. And I mean, the whole idea, I think somebody else mentioned this earlier about, sort of staying away from the media. In a sense, if the cannon fodder for the media are the residents of a locality, for instance, okay, then there's been a conscious attempt in many parts of the country and as well as in the world about citizens not wanting to talk to the press. And there's this whole sort of idea being proposed in terms of media economism, which means that there is a less engagement with the media, not only as viewers, but also as sources. And that, again, for me, is an equally sort of dangerous kind of phenomena which is emerging, in recent times. So I think there's much more to the idea of a kind of a forced narrative which is being thrown at us every day, than only, in a sense, while it's important, the kind of forces which are behind that. And the moment, in a sense, these forces are ideological in their sense, that narrative then takes a very different kind of form.
So, Ram Manohar, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm very much here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, we both spoke about letters to the editor, and you had a very interesting position as reader's editor at Scroll for about 2 years. And I think that's a fascinating position because that's one way in which news organizations respond to criticism civilly, engage with it, and are accountable to it, and have a sort of a two-way communication. So, just from your experiences there, and also as a journalist for so long, what are the most common sort of criticisms that you got from your readers about the media in general, or what is it that um, you know and this is presumably an audience that wants to have a rational, sane engagement, has a point to make, but also wants to make it, without trolling or abusing a journalist. So, what are the sort of, points of criticism, and are we living up to them as a digital media organization? Because a lot of it would probably be applicable to a lot of other media organizations.
I'll talk about that. I mean, I'll link up to that. I'd just like to go back to your question about distrust, and that will link up to what you asked about reader's editor. See, one thing about why we are being distrusted is that one is, of course, taking the farmers' movement, for example. The farmers feel that we are not reporting the issue. The other thing that we should recognize is that we are living at a time where there is an attempt to delegitimize mainstream media, if you want. I mean, you can include television in that. I mean, it's happened in the US. Trump was using social media to delegitimize media. He called it fake media. And it's happening here at a huge scale through WhatsApp. Okay. There's this somewhat deliberate, maybe not deliberate, attempt to spread fake news and to say the media is not doing its job. So this is the news. Why aren't you reporting it? So in a sense, I think we are in the midst of, I don't know if it's a worldwide phenomenon. It's very prevalent in India. The media is distrusted because of, so far, a fairly successful attempt to say that you are fake media. What we are hearing on WhatsApp, what we are reading on Facebook, that is the news. Okay, so that there's that source of distrust as well, and I think we need to recognize that. And then the third, of course, is what Seema said. The rise of corporate culture in the media, especially the rise of advertising dominance, which has made viewers and consumers of news distrust us. I'd like to link this up because, at Scroll, readers would surprisingly, the complaints that I got were almost entirely of this kind, that you are pushing only one point of view. What about this news? And invariably, that news was what so-and-so had seen on Facebook or seen on WhatsApp. It had not been cross-checked. It had not been fact-checked. It was also, it was sort of saying that, Scroll was, of course, one of those independent voices. So it's saying that, look, you are not being part of the nation building project. Nobody said anti-national, but that was the implication. So it was that kind. I mean, I was a reader's editor when 2016 to 2018. That was when all this was building up. So it was that kind of news. It was not criticism in terms of why aren't you covering this, or these facts are wrong, etc. It was more of counterposing what Scroll was saying and criticizing Scroll's independent views and comparing it with what was being circulated in social media. So I think somewhere as journalists and as consumers of news, you can say readers, etc., viewers, we have to recognize that we are living at a time where political, social forces are deliberately, and I think we have to say that explicitly, are out to delegitimize media because they find that they have this technology that can reach people to push their kind of news, which is actually not news. It's it's fake news. It's political mobilization of a certain kind.
So we've spoken about mistrust, and we've largely been a bit pessimistic about what the media has been doing. But I think we're among a very young crowd, and some of them probably want to be journalists. So we should also be a bit hopeful about the industry and the good things that are happening. I can say that a lot of journalists, I mean, I can say this for myself and perhaps maybe even our panel, those of who are in journalism, that once you become a journalist, you can't think of doing anything else. And once you're in the news, you want to be working in the news. Most journalists would say that. And Ram, I wanted to come to you. Investigative journalism, easily the most exciting thing that most people want to do the moment they become journalists. You watch a spotlight. Now this generation, of course, watches a spotlight and think, wow, that's what I want to do. Want to bring down the powerful. I want to hold the powerful accountable. So you've helmed investigations at the Hindu. Tell us a bit about why it's important, and also a bit on why we are seeing so little of it. And I'm not talking about the usual suspects, but even among established newspapers and good intentioned news organizations, it's hard to do it. Why?
Yeah, if you permit me to lay out the background to this and then kind of zone in on investigation. It'll take a few minutes. I'll do that. If you look at what journalism is about, using shorthand, I'd say the credible information function first. That's very important, and that's trust is involved, believability, credibility at least at the surface. That's one function number one, or role number one. Two, a critical function, by whatever name call. It's analytical, it's investigative, it's watchdogism sometimes. It could be adversarial, but it's subsumed under the caption, the critical function. Then thirdly, an educational role. We don't do it very well, but we do it all the time on economics, on politics, on commerce, on sports, on the arts, and so on. If you do these things well, you come to something that can be called an agenda building role, not agenda setting, which is too tall a claim, but along with others, build an agenda, and I hope a virtuous agenda, a good agenda that serves the public good by and large. Then you have the well-known propaganda role on which Chomsky and Herman have written, and there's been quite a lot of literature on that subject. I won't get into that. If you look, now these are, I think, the functions or roles, or this provides you a conceptual framework, at least for me it does, in which you do your job. Investigation being part of it. I'll come to that in a minute. Now, in a very interesting book called Out of Print, George Brock, a former editor of the Times Group, Sunday Times in particular, also a journalism teacher, has looked at the future. And he says that for the 21st century, given what Ram Manohar has just sketched for us, the changes, the undermining of the foundations, the rules have changed with the digital age. What is going to work? What are the tasks of journalism? And he identifies the following, the core. One is verification, no particular order. Then you have bearing witness. It's what reporters do. 3, sense making. And then you come to investigation. These are the things. Investigation, I think, is very important. But I'd like to recall the caution uttered by Marquez in a well-known talk on journalism education. He says, don't make a big deal of it. I mean, there's a song and dance around investigation. All good journalism is investigative. That's a statement. It doesn't mean, it's not to be taken literally, because there is a specialization. You need time, you need specialized skills, you need new tools to investigate. Data journalism forms part of it. Data visualization, and enormously hard work. But all good journalism, that is, other than just the routine coverage, which AI can handle in some cases, is investigative in the sense you dig beneath the surface, you check facts, you verify, you provide context and background, and so on. And I think in India, you've had a pretty good track record. And it's not just in modern times. The Amartya Sen has written on the role of the statesman in the Bengal famine, 1940 to 43, where it blows the whistle on crisis. We are not very good, Amartya Sen said, in several in writings as well as lectures, in exploring endemic hunger. But when it comes to crisis hunger, I think the press has been performed above itself, you can say, several sections of the Indian press. And I've looked into some of the coverage of this from the early 20th century in a paper I did for a research institute. And I think this holds true just beyond the Bengal famine. So you have exposés of corruption in the Madras presidency. The Arbuthnot banking scandal was investigated by the Hindu and other newspapers. And then you come to the modern times, the Indian Express, and then some of the magazines, today Caravan, and certainly for the Hindu, I would, it's not just Bofors. I was involved in some of the IMF deal, at that time in 1981-82, the world's largest line of credit, India borrowed from the IMF something like 6 billion SDR, 5 billion SDR, over 6 billion US dollars, and the conditionality is around it. And we brought it out at that time, and then Bofors, and you have various other examples. Some work, but one lesson I learned from this is the investigative journalist or team. And then you had, of course, WikiLeaks, which was part investigation and part benefiting from a leak of huge amounts of data, which came our way, the US embassy cables. Those have been my experiences, Rafale. But one thing I've learned is don't fret about the outcome too much. Because if you're outcome oriented while doing investigations, I think you could get into trouble, and you'll also get demoralized very often, because it doesn't depend on you alone. You may bring out what you think are irrefutable facts about, say, a corruption scandal or about something else, something that cannot be defended publicly by those in power. But other institutions don't look at it the same way. Sometimes they'll say that it doesn't meet the standards of the Evidence Act. We can't continue. We can't prosecute successfully, even if they file cases. Or those institutions may actually sabotage the investigation and prosecution when it goes to, it becomes legal. So I've had lots of experience.
Okay.
Sorry?
Don't worry too much about the outcome is your...
Yeah, do the right thing. Don't fret over the outcome. Almost the Bhagavad Gita, and I'm an atheist, but I think that makes a lot of sense.
So Seema, I'll come to you. And what keeps you going as a reporter, writer? We've talked about depressing things, but I'm sure you wouldn't want to do anything other than journalism if you were given a choice. So hopeful ending.
Yeah, absolutely. I think news is
advice for people who may want to become reporters, if you want to give some.
Yeah, and I think news itself is like a drug, and then you become an addict the minute you experience it or you smell it. And it's something you just never get away. I mean, this letter to the editor, when you guys were talking about it, I remember in school I was firing off letters to the editor of Times of India at the age of 14, and when it used to get published with my byline, I mean, just your name. But that gave me such a kick, and it still gives you a kick. There's something so amazing in handling news, though, of course, a lot of the fun is being taken away. But even so, there's so much to write on. And I just want to go into this thing of investigative journalism, because I do believe that all good journalism, like Ram said, is investigative. You don't, somehow when young people think about it, they think about, taking out some file out from the Ministry of Home Affairs and etc. I don't think it's all about that. I think it's all about bringing far more information. I remember in the Indian Express, when we were young reporters, we decided that we would investigate those two-liners that you have, about Dalits, a Dalit girl raped, a Dalit youth set on fire. And they used to be used in the print media as fillers without any information. So we got our editors, Malgaonkar was the editor, to give us 2 pages, and we were all young reporters. And we fanned out into really the hinterland. And I had to go somewhere in Balia at that time to investigate a rape. And we had decided that we would not just talk about the rape, but we would talk about the caste composition of the police station there. We talk about the socio-political situation in which this Dalit family was living, etc., not to go into it, but this was all investigation. And we had 2 pages of amazing reports coming out from different people, different reporters. It's all about getting more facts in, not going by what the agencies tell you, the basics. So it's like if you're covering the migrant or the farmer's stir, what's happening on the munch is the routine news. What's happening in the villages that are supporting that munch is the investigation. And that's where you're going further in, and how well you do it shows how great a journalist you are. And just to sort of, I know you're running out of time, but I just want to also add this whole thing about irreverence, which we both spoke about. I think it's extremely important. We were taught when we were young journalists by the professional editors, which not many exist now, that you don't stand up for the prime ministers and the ministers. You only stand up for the president because he represents the state and the flag. The prime ministers, I remember we used to go for meetings and nobody ever stood up when the prime minister walked in because they elected representatives. You can do it as an act of individual respect. But what I'm trying to say is that journalism has irreverence. It needs the irreverence to be able to question. You have to have that curiosity, that honesty, but also the irreverence. Right now, unfortunately, because of the control of corporates, I'm going back to my favorite theme, we are taught how to be conformist. And the more conformist you are, the worse a journalist you are. So you have to break out of borders and barriers. And I'm sure a lot of young people are doing it. You can see it every day on the, on the roads, literally, of the way these videos are being made, which you and I might not be able to get it done, but the kind of questions, the interviews, the spot information that is coming out so spontaneously from maybe, again, I'm going back to farmers because that's what's happening right now from the farmers' stuff.
So Ram Manohar, do you want to tell us what keeps you going and what's the beauty of news that's kept you in? Hopeful words for our young students here.
Sorry, talking about young people who would be thinking of journalism, I think in a strange way, it is there's much greater responsibility now to be a journalist, a good journalist, okay? Because there is
too many bad ones out there. That's
sorry. Well, yeah, I'm not going to say that. Yeah, and I think there's a job to be done. It's a difficult job. The only thing I would say is that in India today, if you're thinking of being a journalist, then think of the digital media, because that's where the challenges, that's where the forces against journalism as we know it are gathering force, but that's also where there are opportunities, okay? There are opportunities, there are many independent small ventures trying to do their thing, some very well, some not so well. But that's where it is. I mean, television, we know what's happening there. And print, again, is weighed down by so much else. So there is a lot that can be done. And I would say that if you're thinking of being a journalist, then yes, you should. And yes, don't think you're going to change the world and, enter journalism that way. And as the others said, that it's not just investigative journalism that we should look at it. All journalism is investigative, and I would pay a lot of attention to what we would call explanatory journalism. So explaining things, that is what, in a sense, we need now.
Yeah, and it's also hugely in demand. People do want that. Sometimes just being explained. Vibodh, you called yourself outsider 2-3 times during this panel. As an outsider, what do you want us to do better? What do you want in terms of the news scene, the media scene? What do you want to see changing? And do you even think that there could be, or do you think we're going to go down the slide that we're going down in currently? Where do you see this culminating?
Yeah, I'm of course a terrible skeptic, but because I also do research in a sense that doesn't really,
that's good,
can't quite sustain the idea in that sense. Yeah, but I think a couple of things in a sense are important. Is actually more discussion on and about the media in the media. I think that's something which has been lacking. I remember about 10 years ago, leading newspapers had sort of media reporters, commentators, columnists, and so on and so forth. I mean, Hindu, of course, had one, is always ahead of the curve. Express had one. There was a time when Mint actually had 2 columns on the media, and I think a lot of that perhaps needs to be revived. In terms of the media talking about itself and open to discussions perhaps with those outside the media. I think that is something which we are really lacking here. Even, I guess, as a country also, we don't like to talk about ourselves, about the sort of, issues which are a bit tricky. But I think that discussion has to be broadened beyond the newsroom, beyond training schools, to have this idea of talking about the media in a way which is just beyond kind of criticism. Because I guess that doesn't really have any value. You could sort of do that on other platforms. But media commentary and criticism analysis for that, and that's something, one really important aspect which really needs to be encouraged. Making this kind of bridge between those inside the media, those who are outside, those who are studying the media, those who are viewing the media. I don't use the word consumer very, very rarely. I mean, but those who are the audiences. And I think on the other side, and this is again being an outsider, I would actually like, in a sense, talking to the students here, so perhaps pull them more towards what I do, in a sense, which is, I think, much more systematic analysis of the media from all its kind of vantage points. Very often in discussions on media and media criticism, a large amount of literature, largely which is evoked, is from the West. And I think there is a large amount of to be learned about ourselves as a country and as the history of our country. If you look at the way in which the news has evolved in the past, and of course, much more so even today. For example, very often I would see good journalists who are trying to analyze the way in which narrative has unfolded, or the way in which stories have sort of come out. There was something on the Caravan more recently about the idea of news across television channels there. And I think that would be helped by something more systematic way of doing those things and then putting them out there.
Please continue. You can finish your point.
Yeah, I think that the other problem, in a sense, from our side is that as sort of researchers and scholars in the media, our constituency is largely other people like us. Okay, which at one point of time, they're across the world. I mean, there are a bunch of us, but of course, we then tend to talk to each other. Okay, whereas the criticism and discussions on the media again are happening within sort of the media, and the frustration then which is happening amongst the audiences is happening amongst themselves. And I think there needs to be this kind of dialogue across different kinds of interests. I won't use the word stakeholders, but those who have a stake in the good media. Let's put it that way. That dialogue, perhaps, I think is really important. And for me, an evening like this is perhaps something which would really kind of, contribute to these kind of discussions. And that for me is a positive step.
Great. And speaking of media critique, we have Krishna Prasad with us, who's one of the very early media critics, I would say. I really love reading his fun blog Churmuri, and I've been following him for quite some time. So, do you want to just, before we take questions, do you want to just come in with your thoughts? If you've been listening to us, I can't see you on the.
No, you can't see me, but I'm not properly dressed for this. Sorry.
Now I can see you. Now I can see you. Great, great. Do you want to come in?
Sorry, but I didn't come here to take part at all. But let me just say two things. All of us in journalism love to kind of flagellate ourselves. So self-flagellation is endemic and intrinsic to the media. And I think we see enough evidence of it. And frankly, I would pose this question in a contradictory fashion. I would say that we in the media, or large parts of mainstream media, are continuing to do what we did very well. I think what we need to recognize when we sit in a debate like this is that the universe of the reader or the viewer or the listener has shifted. And I think two things I will draw your attention to. One is a landmark piece written by Professor Prabhat Patnaik in the early 2000s, where he spoke of the morals, the media, and the middle class, and where Professor Patnaik essentially said that the moral universe of the reader has shifted. I think we need to keep that in mind to understand what is happening. And the second thing I'll say, and since we are all in a media class, I think all of us will claim to have read George Orwell in 1984. But I think an even more important book for young people to read is Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Because whilst Orwell talks of Big Brother controlling us, as Professor Parthasarathi very rightly said, we are now in an abundance model. And I think that is the second thing to keep in mind to understand what is happening, which is that as opposed to a Big Brother controlling us, there's now just so much information coming out, so many outlets. I think, that is really what has shifted, the ground that has shifted under our feet for the media. So I would say this, that we continue to do, large parts of the media continue to do a very honest job. But two things have happened. In the post-liberalized world, I think the reader, listener, viewers, universe has shifted. Secondly, because of new technology and the cell phone and the smartphone, there is an abundance model which Huxley talks about, and therefore we are just far too distracted. Mr. Ram spoke of all the great issues that have confronted us in the recent past. But if you go to a party in Delhi or Bombay or Bangalore, you will not find people talking about it because their universe is now around this one small smartphone. And that universe which they create is the universe they inhabit. And so therefore, if it does not meet their or match their interests or match their view, there's this contradictory view that comes across about what the media is doing. So therefore, the mainstream media, in a sense, has been reduced to a validating machine. So does it validate the view I already have through my phone? That is the second point I'll make. And the final point I'll make is that it's great to talk about the Hindu and the Express and Scroll and all that. My God, but that is not the issue. I think what we should really look at, and all these young students should look at, is the pathetic state of India's language media. So pathetic that the brand leaders in every language are basically cheerleaders for the mob. And that is something we must really keep in mind. I think we in English language media still are great islands of hope and excellence. But the language media, is shocking beyond belief. So shocking that one of the biggest purveyors of fake news is also one of India's certified fact checkers. So that should tell you the state of Indian media in the languages, whether it is Hindi, Telugu, Kannada, Malayalam, Tamil. You go to any language, Marathi also, you will find that we are really looking at a very depleted scene. So these are just the three things I thought I should say, because I think the weaponization of media is a very huge issue. But I think we should recognize that the post-liberalized Indian's mind has changed. The device of receiving news has changed. And also, I think the biggest point is the state of language media, which is really, nobody even talks about it when I come to panels like this, but that is the issue. And that is what has changed India's politics. That is what has changed India's, essential liberal ethos. And I think we've lost so much. It's unbelievable.
In fact, Dhanya Rajendran of the News Minute, we were in a conversation with her recently, and she said some of the things being said on Kannada channels about Disha Ravi is just shocking. The Hindi English channels aren't even close to what's being, talked about her. Completely unsubstantiated stuff, and the reach they have again is unimaginable. So I'm going to take some questions. Anyone from the panel, please feel free to take them because they aren't really addressed to anyone. These are just questions that are thrown at me, so please feel free to take them, whoever would like to. One of my favorite points of contemplation. When we talk about media as afflicting the comfortable, are we also thinking in terms of media as a form of activism? Journalists, are we activists too? Would anybody like to take that?
Yes, I don't think anything is excluded because journalism is not strictly a profession in the sense of medicine, or you don't need any specific diploma or qualification, although that is desired these days. But you could be without a degree at all and still be a pretty good journalist. And therefore, all kinds of people will get in, and I think it's a large tent which accommodates it. But we can make a distinction between professional journalism and the rest. So yes, journalists can be active. Though I would like to say that those who claim that they are absolutely objective, or if you see the New York Times' rules, don't go and participate in this political rally and so on. However, I think some of it is too sanctimonious for my taste. Everyone has a position. We do all kinds of things. Politicians are in touch. Sometimes they ask you for advice. So let's not pretend to be monastic in our professionalism. But it's a good thing to seek to be professional. The codes of ethics, professional ethics, such as they are, I think it's worthwhile. To the extent we can be professional or quasi-professional, I think that would be a good thing. So activism has a place in it. Depends on your judge what you want to do, where what kind of trust activists will get, and so on. But often under the veneer of neutrality, there is false equivalence. There is sort of looking down on activists and so on. So I think we have to have a serious discussion on this.
I think also, Manisha, on objectivity, there is nothing like an objective journalist. This is absolutely ridiculous because journalists are expected to write for the constitution or for the underprivileged or for the marginalized and bring those voices to the corridors of power. Journalism is adversarial. It is against, it questions, even if it isn't against, it questions establishment, it questions those in power, it questions authority. And it takes a position for the people who are at the receiving end of this authority. So to come in and say there is something like objectivity, then those are the people actually who are not objective and who are playing some kind of dirty politics. You're already in a position where you have to take a position away from neutrality. There's nothing like neutrality when you're in the field.
I think if I could just come in on that a little bit, I think sort of complicating this idea of neutrality and objectivity, I think perhaps it's equally important to sort of do that with the idea of criticism, which also often tends to get a bit fetishized. And there was a very famous statement by Prime Minister Gujarat when he was the information broadcasting minister. And when he said something like, there should not be any self-interest in criticism, and I think that was quite interesting in terms of sort of connecting with what I was trying to say earlier, this whole idea of speech and reach. If a certain kind of criticism has a very large market, very often that market is created because that criticism is motivated there for interests of advertisers, of owners, and now, of course, distributors as well there. So I think some of these ideas which we have inherited about journalism, and unfortunately many of them are actually taught actively in journalism schools, we need to perhaps reflect a little bit more about this, keeping in mind the different kinds of kind of forces that are acting upon us. I mean, there was this emphasis on the need for the digital layer. And one of the things which of course the digital distributors, who we now call intermediaries, were sort of selling for many years, was this idea that they distribute news in a kind of objective manner. Okay, and sort of this line was bought until about 8-9 years ago all over the world. But distribution again has certain motivations into it, whether it's being distributed by Google or distributed by Facebook and so on and so forth. And that, of course, most of that has come to light over the last 4 or 5 years. And I think that for me is a little bit of a thing to keep in mind when you're talking about digital journalism, because you've got this new player in the ecosystem who's not a journalist, who's not an advertiser, who's not an owner, but who is this sort of distributor, and who is increasingly playing a very strong role and actually impacting the role of those legacy players there, while claiming to be, or at least claiming this idea of objectivity, that what we get in our news feed, what we distribute, is a sort of done by a machine. Yeah? And therefore the idea of objectivity is then transferred from the journalist and the editor to that machine, as though the machine was not made by a human being. Yeah? And I think some of these things then for me are really interesting to look at in terms of how our inherited ideas of objectivity have kind of got completely muddled with the entry of new players. Yeah.
Okay. Next question. Contemporary media has partially succeeded in making us headline monkeys. Do we often overlook context and just form opinions based on headlines? Maybe you want to take that, Ram Manohar?
I have a quick, anyway, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Interesting question. Yeah, I mean, in journalism also now places so much importance on capturing eyeballs through the headline.
Yeah, clickbait.
Yeah, but there it's up to you as a reader, viewer, to look beyond the headline, not to fall victim to that. The problem is that if you get ensnared by the headline, by a catchy headline, then you are falling victim to that. I mean, I think you should look at the content as a reader or as a viewer and try and see what the headline says or doesn't say, and don't accept that. I mean, I think there the responsibility is more on the reader or viewer. And yeah, as the media is also responsible there. There's a infamous, I would say, headline that was used in the Falklands War, which was often taught in the journalism schools, but it was a horrible headline when the sinking of an Argentinian ship was emblazoned in one of the English dailies as "gotcha." Okay, that was that was a sub-editor's dream, but it was actually a very, very, let's say, I would even say a criminal headline to use. So it's really up to us as readers and viewers not to fall victim to the headline snaring that takes place.
Vibodh, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, this whole idea, I mean, you talked about monkeys, and I mean, the question for me would be, in a sense, how do I come across that headline there? I think we need to sort of pose this question. How do I come across that headline? And my answer to that is, of course, the other saying that, if you offer peanuts, you get monkeys. Okay, so if we, in a sense, subscribe to trash, then the headline that we come across would be of a particular sort.
So make an effort yourself.
Well, I think it's also important in terms of we tend to think of news as being so important, fourth pillar and so on and so forth. Yet, to some extent, we are not willing to pay something for something which we think is as important.
Yeah.
Okay. And that for me is again something, and now I'm sort of taking the burden off you journalists onto us, the audience. Yeah. I mean, especially, of course, the point on regional media is very well taken here. But I mean, if you look at the price at which regional media is made available, it's incredible. So I think that there is a certain sense in terms of wanting quality, wanting fidelity, wanting verification, and all these kind of sort of desires that we have. They perhaps, there is a cost to that. So if you want to read a good book, we have to perhaps pay a little bit more.
Yeah.
If you want to read trash, we can always photocopy.
We've been saying this at Newslaundry for a very long time. You have to pay to keep news free. And if you're not going to pay, then you'll have to just make do with the primetime dramas. If you want quality journalism,
Absolutely,
you have to pay for it, because it's a costly, sending a reporter to a place, news gathering, production, all of that costs money. So yeah,
And, I mean, for me,
if you get a Netflix subscription, then you should also think of subscribing
really,
to news.
It's really interesting to sort of see when I travel abroad to universities. I take newspapers from here to show them. I think the most interesting thing is everybody sees that is this newspaper costs nothing compared to in every other democracy, mature or otherwise. There is a certain cost for news. I think that perhaps is I'm not saying it's the only reason. I don't want to make a fetish out of that. If you pay more, you get better quality. I'm not saying that.
No, but
definitely, if you don't pay anything,
Yeah.
I just want to add a little nugget to this of information that when it was the print media, the baron who insisted on keeping the price down is the one who gives the most Reddy to housewives at the end of the day. And that was the Jains of Times of India. At every meeting, and especially came on, he just wanted to sell that whole newspaper for 1 rupee. And others who for whom subsistence was on the subscription to some extent would try and stop it. But he got his way eventually. And this is where, again, that control comes, where you bring down the prices deliberately because you play on the people's desire not to pay for news, and then sell it and then make sure they buy it, because by the end of the day or the month when you sell it, you get more money than what you paid for news.
Next question. There's always a concept of private and public sphere, and there's a boundary between them. So how much can a journalist enter a person's private life to get some news or some evidences to some issues? Who would like to take that?
May I?
Yes, please.
I thought about this, and I think a journalist has, of course, there are all kinds, but a good journalist has no business being intrusive unless there is some social or political significance to that quest. Of course, Vibodh earlier raised the question, reach for what purpose? And that's, I think, the key question. So what's the purpose of this attempted intrusion or breaking the normal rules of the game, and sometimes breaking the law to get at that, an image or some information? So the first rule, I think, for before you go for it is, what is the purpose of it? What do you expect out of it? Even if you can't envisage everything that comes out of it, you've got a clear idea. So it's either on or off. If it's for titillation, if it's for sensationalism, not serving any public purpose, no, out. 2, it has to be supervised. It has to be supervised by somebody senior or at least responsible in the newsroom or the head of that department. Somebody has to take the responsibility. And in some media organizations where deception is used, usually to get into somebody's private life, you got to resort to deception, unorthodox means, breaking rules of the profession, breaking the law at times. Then I think it has to be carefully supervised, and the supervision may have to go right to the top, the editor or editor-in-chief of the news organization here. And the reporter or the investigator who wishes to do this has to come clean to the supervisor about everything. Who tipped him off on this? What's the source of the information? Nothing can be concealed. If you say, I can't disclose that to you. We don't take the story. Those would be the rules that I would lay down if I were in charge of this. An attempted intrusion into somebody's private affairs, bedroom, whatever. They sometimes hack phones. There was a big scandal in the UK which led to the Leviston report, inquiry and report, and so on. So I think you have to raise the bar on this, because there have been many mishaps in recent times, particularly the tabloid press in the UK, the newspaper, as some of you know.
Great. Okay, now that it's clear that self-regulation of media by fact-checking and analyzing their content does not work when they already have an agenda, how would you propose that ad-funded media be held accountable without any problematic government intervention? So I think what the question is that because most media organizations are dependent on advertisements, they have to at some point serve the advertiser rather than serve the viewer or the news consumer. Who'd like to take that? How do we make an ad-funded model accountable?
I'll just comment briefly and to build on this, and to give some context and history. I think Ram referred to Chomsky and Herman's book, on manufacturing dissent. I would recommend, it's still, 40 years later, I would recommend that as reading to understand. It was written in the context of the Vietnam War about American media. Anyway, one of the points that they make is that in the 30s and 40s, readers, in a sense, owned the media, in the sense they were not proprietors, but they subscribed, they paid subscription, they paid for the newspaper, and the newspapers depended on these subscriptions. Okay, there were ads, but it was subscription income that, in a sense, gave viability to the newspapers. And the working class, the middle class, in a sense, they took pride in, there were different kinds of newspapers, but, different groups took pride in their publication of their choice. That changed, I think, the world over, 70s, 80s, and maybe in India, I don't really know. It went the furthest, the 90s, as Seema was saying. Of course, there's that very well-known, but it's not saying, comment that one of the owners of Times of India gave the New Yorker, and he said that, look, we are not in the news business, we are in the advertiser business. So that is what has happened, that the advertiser dominance has taken over media, and what we need to do is roll it back. It's not going to be easy to give primacy to readers, viewers, owning the media. I'm using owning in a particular in a sense that they pay for the news. It is theirs because it is not that of the advertisers, and therefore the publications or TV channels will not sing to the tune of the advertisers. It may seem a bit of far-fetched, idyllic world, but I think that's where one has to work towards, and that's what elements of digital media, including, for example, News Minute, Newslaundry, etc., are working towards.
Great. Okay, I'll just take one last question because our time's up, and then we'll hand over to our wonderful hosts. Last question. Could you talk about the connection between media and the generation of consent, manufacturing consent and media? Much has been written about it, but does anyone want to take this?
Yes, I think you see it particularly on economic issues. When neoliberalism is totally dominant, whether it's the UPA or NDA or in most states, I think that's what has been in the ascendancy. There's hardly any criticism outside the Economic and Political Weekly, which Ram Manohar Reddy used to edit with distinction. I think they constantly look into political economy. It's a very fine publication, almost unique. I don't know many in other parts of the world. Some of us may consider it heavy, but I think it's really worth reading, because with that significant exception, I would say everyone, including the Hindu, I think we are all in this in this frame where there is very little questioning of the neoliberal schema, if you like, way of thinking. And I think it has, whatever be your views on it, you have to have a discourse on it, a critical discourse, constantly challenge many of the tenets of that. It may happen in here or there in newspaper articles, but in a serious way, I think that's an area where manufacturing consent has been totally successful, particularly from the early 90s, I would say, the last 30 years, 3 decades, hardly any challenge to this, because they see that the economy has grown, incomes have increased, but on the other side, India has the largest mass of deprivations that any country in the world has. We are by no means the most backward, but we have the largest mass, and attempts are being made to minimize it, to underestimate it. Definitions of poverty are changing, but I think on the basic issues, people like Prabhat Patnaik, Jayati Ghosh, various others, even Amartya Sen, I think they have significant critiques. Our economists have it, that this is hardly reflected in the media. It's the policymakers who set the agenda. And that I think more than any other area, this is where the propaganda model has worked brilliantly, if you like, for those who advocate those policies.
Great. So I'll end with this. I'll just take one last question because I think I must take it because I'm from a digital portal. So this is a question from I don't know who, but it's to everyone. With n number of digital portals coming up and all of them branding themselves as saviors of free speech, how can the common man be convinced of the merits and values of trusting actual news portals that bring news and not infotainment? I just want to add to this that I think a bunch of digital organizations like Newslaundry, News Minute, Scroll, Wire, we're all trying a new model of news, which is to veer away from advertisements, dependent on advertisements, to a more subscriber or oriented business model. For Newslaundry, for example, we are only dependent on subscriptions. Now, it's not a perfect model, but it does allow you way more independence than a lot of other news organizations dependent on an ad-funded model. So I think you should give it a shot. And I think that there's no question of blindly trusting journalists or making heroes out of anyone. I think you should consume as much news from trusted portals as possible. You should question media. You should hold your journalists accountable. You should hold all news organizations accountable, but with facts on your side and not just as a trolling time pass. So I would say that a lot of the digital portals that have come out are worth your time, purely also because they're trying a new model of news that hasn't been tried before. And that that means that you should be open to reading a lot more, educating a lot more about these portals, reading what they have to offer you, and also question them. Every informed citizen should question their media. Does anybody want to add to that? And then I could just end.
May I commend your digital portals? George Broke, whom I mentioned earlier, says that it's like throwing spaghetti at the wall and some of it will stick, but a lot of it should stick, because this model, I think, is an antidote to the propaganda role that the mainstream media play. And I think it constantly reminds us that there is another kind of journalism possible. Also, the business side, I think, subscription-based should work over the longer term. So I think don't undervalue or underestimate this. Nobody should. And we really want to commend it, I'm sure. Sorry, Seema.
No, I'm sorry, I was interrupting, but before we just close, I think, there was a time before television when all of us just had the print media and all newspapers, all journalists took all the newspapers that you were getting in that particular city. And then you got your information from 5 newspapers or 10 newspapers. It was mandatory. In fact, the newspaper houses paid for that. As you move, and now you're in what is called the information revolution, where you have gadgets, you've got access to anything in any part of the world. I think information should be used by young people as a weapon. Don't rely on any one source. Go to many sources and then Start judging for yourself. I mean, don't say, I can't say that this one particular paper is going to give you everything, because it never does. It never did. And we knew as journalists, because we took about 5 or 8 newspapers and realized everybody had a lot more to say about a different story. So if you want to get the information, it's not just digital. There is still print, there is digital, there is information across. Try and zoom in on good sources, fact-check sources. We all know the crap from the good. Everybody who is educated or intelligent enough, I don't like to use the word educated because it doesn't mean much, but everybody who's intelligent enough and is able to read and understand will know. After all, your farmers know that, you know, their Trolley Times is giving you more information about the movement than any of us all put together. So let's go. And if you want to know about the farmers, don't read us. Read what they themselves are authentically giving to you. Read that as well. I mean, not only, but read that. So there's so much information available. Let's make the best of it, not the worst of it, which is what we are becoming. We are becoming the worst. We're just reading that rubbish and going out to kill.
So just a footnote from my side.
Very hopeful note.
Sorry.
Please
Just
go
a
ahead.
footnote from my side, since I'm in the business of writing footnotes. I think what would help is perhaps to sort of directly go to the websites of certain news outlets, rather than relying on feeds from Facebook and so on and so forth. I think that perhaps is also something which is important as we engage with this digital world. You know, so like journalists have to go to the source, I think the readers ought to go to the outlet, rather than waiting for somebody to sort of, you know, serve parts of the outlet to us, so to say. Which is why, of course, I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on Twitter, and so on and so forth, to go to the source. And I think that is a habit which we perhaps just need to develop. Like we read many newspapers in the morning, or perhaps browse TV channels, to actually go to the website and see what's laid out there, rather than to rely on somebody else to sort of tell me what I should read this morning.
Great. On that note, I shall end this discussion. Thank you so much. It was a great learning experience for me. I hope you all took back something from this. Thank you so much to all the panel, and I'll hand over back to the media cell.
Great moderation.
Yeah, thank you, Manisha.
Thank you.
Okay. Somebody from St. Stephen's wants to take over.
Anisha, do you have something to say? Yeah. Okay. Good evening, all respected members of the panel, exec and other members of Media Cell, Stephanians and other journalists, and also media enthusiasts. So first of all, thank you all for joining in this amazing session. As you all know, this is the first official event of Media Cell in college. And we have such an exciting panel with us right now. So on behalf of Media Cell and the Stephanian community, I would like to express our heartfelt gratitude to our members of panel, Mr. N. Ram, Director of the Hindu Group, Dr. Manohar Reddy, Founder Editor of the India Forum, Ms. Seema Mustafa, Editor, The Citizen, and Mr. Vibodh Parthasarathi, Associate Professor at Jamia, Milia, Islamia, and as well as to our amazing moderator, Ms. Manisha Pande, who is the Executive Editor at Newslaundry. So thank you for accepting our invite and being a part of this discussion today with us. It was indeed an interesting session. So thank you again. I also would like to thank our principal, Professor John Verghese, for his constant support and encouragement. I like to thank the admin and all my dear friends and volunteers of the talk and workshop vertical of Media Cell for conducting and managing this event smoothly. Special thanks to Mr. Krishna Prasad for being here right now. Lastly, I'd like to thank every one of you for attending this session. Thank you for registering, for volunteering. I hope you all had enjoyed this discussion. In fact, we would love to hear from you after this meeting. So thank you for joining in. I'd also like to take this opportunity to invite you all to the annual Fest of Media Cell, which is named the Fourth Estate, sponsored by BNPS International. It will happen on March 1st to 4th, and we'll be having mock press conference and news reading competition open to all students and colleges. A big thanks to our parent sponsor, BNPS International. Please make sure that you make yourself a part of this event. Exciting prizes await the winners. Stay tuned to us for more updates. Once again, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Right.